states by departments of education, by boards of education, etc.?
Sure. I have opinions, but they do not reflect the official position of the United States Department of Education. I'll say that first in all seriousness. Now, in my experience, policy by fiat is completely ineffective. And I think the perfect example is IDA has had a requirement for what at the time was called scientifically based and then became evidence-based practices in students' IEPs. That was a requirement. What percent of the IEPs of 6.2 million kids are taking that into consideration? I would shudder to guess. My experience is that policy is driven by demand, and demand in our field is driven by parents and advocates. And we fund 120 parent centers, and we're constantly saying to organizations, go to them, build the demand for the practice, and then it will happen. If parents go to IEP meetings and say, I would like visual prompting to be part of my child's program, then it can be integrated into the child's program. But just saying to a state, it would be a good idea for you to have a policy on, that includes visual prompting, and that's going to translate into practice, I think is not really a reasonable expectation. For instance, with restraint seclusion, we couldn't tell states what they had to do. We did not have the authority to do that. And I'm not talking about OCR's work, I'm talking about Department of Ed's work. What we put out were 15 principles. Those 15 principles were incorporated into the law of 33 states and countless local school districts who are examining their practices. That can drive things, but we cannot simply say, do this. It's not, we don't have the authority, plus it's not effective.
I want to kind of back that up. I hate to make analogies between autism and things like medical injuries, but just to give an example, blood transfusions are a great evidence-based practice for auto injuries, and physical therapy is also a great evidence-based practice for an auto injury. But that doesn't mean that every single person serving people who've experienced an auto injury should be mandated to give everyone a blood transfusion and physical therapy right there on the spot. And it's really just not a good idea. Some people aren't going to need that. There are people who need both at different times. There are people who, are, for one reason or another, it would actually be harmful. If I were in a minor offender and someone just showed up and needed a blood transfusion, that would be a really bad idea. And I think what really we have to do is give people the tools. I like that this website explains this is a specific challenge that you might respond to with visual prompts. Visual prompts aren't going to do everything. They're not going to answer every problem. And once people are being held accountable for outcomes and saying, you're going to be, whatever you do, you're going to be held accountable for whether it works or not, then professionals, once they're given these tools, can then pick which one they think is going to work.
Well, I think that's a great point, and it's wonderful that this endeavor, that's one of the best things about this endeavor is it doesn't have a single point of view or a single intervention, but provides guidance regarding the interventions that have an evidence base. And I think that's what the question that David, that you proposed was, how do we make sure that people know and use resources that are backed by evidence base? It's one thing to say, of course, to dictate to providers which of the evidence-based practices they should use for which individuals, which of course is way too it's something that I think we all agree might be problematic, but it might be another thing to figure out a way that we can encourage evidence-based practices. I think, David, you pointed out that this is becoming a crowded sphere, and it's not only, at least my understanding, it's not only evidence-based practices that are crowding the universe of online or in-person trainings. And, I don't want to be presumptuous, but at least from the perspective of NIMH, and I think I can say, speaking on behalf of the organization in this respect, that we would really strongly make the statement that if we're going to encourage practices, that they should have an evidence base behind them.
First of all, totally agree with that. I'll give you an example. I call this dialing for dollars. We have people come and want to meet with us, and they have things that they somehow want us to invest in, which of course we can't just do. But yesterday I met with a vendor, actually, who vends weighted clothing and lap weights and this, and I'm not taking a position on it one way or the other, although I did ask him, so do you have situations where that 8-pound weighted lap weight becomes 24 pounds in order to hold the kid in one place? They had no knowledge of such practice, but what I asked them is, why 8 pounds? Why not 5 pounds? Why not 3 pounds? What's your evidence that you made the right decision for that? And he said, well, we're just trying different ones, and they seem to be effective. And then, why do you know this is effective? Well, we're using this in a particular large school district, and we're finding test scores are increasing. Well, yes, Allison, I had this, I said, in the wildest dreams, establishing a causal relationship with weighted left things and test scores going up might be a stretch beyond the stretch. So, I mean, that's that side of it. But the other side, I want to get back to what Sam's stated. I think, yes, demand from parents and advocates is really important, but also building those practices from the get-go. And I think that the data you have relative to pre-service, the use by students, the use by faculty, and having students go through those modules and equipping new teachers, new interventionists with the skill set from the beginning so no one has to demand it is certainly the other side of the coin. And that's a hard. The way we encourage that is we make it free. So, and it's easy. And any professor who has to prep for classes, they have the opportunity to, have a 40-minute, have students take a module, some of which in the class. They like that, and it's evidence-based and it makes sense and it fits into a flipped learning model where they do the modules at home and then they come to the to the class. That's the kind of thing I think that we can encourage. But I think it's encouraging that it's in fact being spontaneously used.
I want to make sure that there are opportunities for individuals from the committee to ask questions on other areas if we get some time, but perhaps we'll come back to this topic of evidence-based practice later if there are questions in other spheres. I mean, otherwise I'm happy to go back to a couple people want to make some comments, so yeah, go ahead.
Another thing, I have follow-up on that, which is earlier. Do you have a way of, for professionals to find search by problem and find the evidence-based practice that could solve it? So let's say I have a kid who doesn't use language. What's an evidence-based practice for that? Or I have a kid with anxiety. Are there evidence-based practices for anxiety listed on the site, et cetera?
We only have it listed by broad categorization of outcomes. I think your idea of identifying maybe the most frequent questions that practitioners might have in looking at what interventions might be most appropriate is really good, but we haven't taken that step.
I think that would be a wonderful resource for people who don't know what terms to search. They know the intervention terms, they just know the challenges they're facing. That was sorry, maybe it was weighted test scores. That was, sorry. I think that so I think there are probably nudges and pushes that could be immediately effective for something like this. So the first, if for example, if one of the recommendations the committee wants to make is about pre-service training, then is there a way to evaluate existing programs and the extent to which their pre-service training provides both training in evidence-based practices and evidence-based training strategies for that. Right? We know there's like a growing number of autism certificate programs. We have no idea the extent to which either schools of the programs of special education or autism-specific programs are including these things. So that would be an easy thing to do and say, hey, look, we're not talking just, we're just saying, here's evidence-based and this program includes it, or doesn't. Another way, on the push side, if you look at the class action lawsuits brought within IDEA over the last 2 decades, the overwhelming majority of them are procedural. They do not, very few, I think only one focuses on student outcomes, a couple focus on staff training, none focuses on the use of evidence-based practice. And I think the challenge is the disconnect between what lawyers think they can sue about and what the real problem is. And not that I'm suggesting we give people fodder to sue school districts, but can we rethink the way we think about using IDEA as a lever, focusing more on the evidence-based practice part and less on the procedural part? And I don't know how the U.S. Department of Education thinks about that, or how state departments of education think about that. But it would be a great way to shift the conversation in a way that education changes what changes. If there are other questions on other topics, I'm happy to anything, but I have a response otherwise to David's, but I want to take the helm. So one of the things that we have, as I said before, in other areas of NIMH's domain, we've dealt with this issue over and over and over again. And one of the more recent things that we've done that's been successful was, we had developed a set of evidence-based practices for treatment of first episode psychosis. And getting that adopted was quite challenging. But what ended up working was, actually, we started out with advocacy groups who lobbied Congress for funding in that area. And Congress then, through the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, gave them money that was specifically used to give block grants to states, which is what SAMHSA does, but with the explicit requirement that evidence-based practice be used for first episode psychosis treatment. Right? And then defined that when the block grants be given out by SAMHSA, that they would consult with NIMH for what those evidence-based practices were. Now, in this case, the Department of Education has defined themselves the evidence-based practice. So, and I don't know to what extent, we fund these kinds of efforts through block grants or other mechanisms, but using, so again, it's not requiring anyone to do anything, but it's providing the opportunity for states to ask for money for help in treatment of the federal government, ask for help in treatment for substance psychosis. But if we're going to give them the money to do it, then they have to say we're going to use an evidence-based practice, and those evidence-based practices are defined by a federal organization that has done the research to define them. So in this case, I could imagine saying to the states, we'll give you some money. I don't know if this happens, but we'll give you some money to treat patients with autism. But if you're going to implement these practices in your schools with our money, you're going to use evidence-based practice. Here's a bunch of evidence-based practices. And one of those resources might be this website. So that's the kind of way that we use it to move evidence-based practices into implementation when we don't have direct control over treatment providers.
Can I make one last concluding comment?
Please.
Yeah. So, and this is in response to some of the questions about about mandating specific evidence-based practices. The SAGA, one of the early leaders in evidence-based medicine, following Cochrane's work, states really clearly that the process of evidence-based medicine is built on specific empirical practices as well as the clinical expertise of the provider. So it's a combination of both having the evidence there and looking for the best sort of available evidence combined with professional skill and knowledge. So I just wanted to finish up on that. Thanks.
It's a great notice. Thank you very much. Okay, we have time now for a break. We're going to reconvene here at 10 minutes after 11, so 20-minute break. And at that point, we'll some committee business. Sorry. Yeah, well, let's start 5 minutes early, make 11:05, so we have a 15-minute break, and we'll see you back here at 11:05. We had some great presentations this morning. Now we're going to proceed to committee business. This is a very exciting time for the committee as we are trying to finalize the strategic plan update, and shepherding that along has been Dr. Susan Daniels, the Director of the Office of Autism Research Coordination at NIMH, and the Executive Secretary of SPID. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan. It's been a monumental effort. I want to thank her and her staff, as well as everyone on the committee and the public who's helped in drafting the strategic plan update.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll dive right in because I want to make sure you have as much time as possible to talk about some of the business. I know that we have some new members of the committee, so just a quick review. The IACP Strategic Plan is a document that provides a blueprint to guide autism-related efforts across several agencies. What he did was label single retinal ganglion cells within the eye of these animals, and then he put the animals in a chamber and provided them with an anterior to posterior moving stimulus or a posterior to anterior moving stimulus for 10 hours a day for 4 days. After which he assayed the resolution or the topographic map by mapping out the positions of the labeled retinal ganglion cells within the eye, here, along the nasal to temporal axis, and he mapped out the position of those axon arbors along the rostral caudal axis within the optic septum. And what he found is shown here, where in animals, so on the y-axis is the axon projection site, and on the x-axis is the position of the retinal ganglion cell body. So what we know from this is that temporal retinal ganglion cells project to the rostral portion of the optic septum, and nasal retinal ganglion cells project to the more caudal portion of the optic septum. And when animals receive this anterior to posterior moving stimulus, they establish topography. But when animals receive the posterior to anterior moving stimulus, there is no topography within the projection of the retinal ganglion cell axons. And that means that if there was information sent from temporal retinal ganglion cells, it would terminate in the same part of the optic septum as retinal ganglion cells from nasal retina communicating information. So there is no topographic information in this projection. And I should say that this is the situation at the beginning of the experiment. So at the first time point, all of the animals had this level, i.e. no topographic information within their map, and the anterior to posterior stimulus allowed them to have this topography, and the posterior to anterior stimulus prevented it. So basically, the way that we think of this is that anterior to posterior motion stimulus enhances the development of the topography. And posterior to anterior degrades it or causes it not to develop. So we think of this basically as a simple example of temporal coding, there's information within the sensory periphery, which is then communicated in a temporal sequence to the retinal ganglion cells in a nasal to temporal, in a temporal to nasal pattern. And it's this activity within the retinal ganglion cells which then communicates the relative position to terminate within the optic septum. So what this meant was that if the retinal ganglion cells in the temporal retina fire first with this anterior to posterior motion stimulus, and that says those retinal ganglion cells terminate in the most rostral region of the optic septum, and any ganglion cell that fires next would terminate sequentially more caudally within the target area. So we wanted to test whether or not this idea of the temporal sequence of ganglion cells determining where they're going to terminate within the optic septum. And so the way that we tested this was by going back to the dually innervated optic septum model that had been developed before, because we know that if we ablate one optic septum, as shown here on the right, that input from both eyes will terminate in the same septum. And this would allow us to then stimulate the two eyes with very tight temporal intervals between the two eye stimulation and determine whether or not this affected the distribution of axons within the septum. And again, the hypothesis is that the input from whichever eye is stimulated first will terminate more rostrally than the input from the eye which is stimulated second. And so we labeled the retinal ganglion cells, put them into a little chamber where their eyes were stimulated at either 15 millisecond intervals, 50 millisecond intervals, or longer. And what we found was that when the retinal ganglion cells of the eye that was stimulated first, they would shift towards more rostral positions within the optic septum, and the inputs that were stimulated second would shift to relatively more caudal positions. And so we call this a spatial to temporal to spatial transformation. And basically, the reason why we think this is important is because it would ensure that retinal ganglion cells' axons would terminate across the entire target area and not be squished up into the rostral portion of the optic septum, as would be predicted from spike-time-dependent plasticity rules. So here what you see is that the retinal ganglion cells would be activated in sequence, and according to the sequential activity pattern, they would terminate in a topographic manner. So just to compare this, what we're calling the spatial to temporal to spatial transformation, the STS, with the heavy coactivity rule, what Hess says is all that really matters is whether or not you're coactive. And if the inputs are coactive, they will be strengthened onto the same target cells. So what we would like to add to that is that it really depends on the sequence of the input activity, and if they are coactive and offset by a certain temporal interval, then they will be adopted an order within the target area. And again, why is this important? It's because spike-timing-dependent plasticity would shift the topographic map towards one end of the target area, and the SDS rule would ensure that this is spread out over time. So let's just look at this, and if we have activity going along this dimension. According to the spike-timing-dependent plasticity rule, the retinal ganglion cells that are activated first would capture all the territory, and they would have strong synapses with all of those targets. But the SDS rule now would ensure that these connections are spread evenly from each input across the target area. I think this is interesting in light of recent work looking at spontaneous waves of activity in the retina, where we now know that these spontaneous waves originate in temporal retina and spread to nasal retina. And recent work in Michael Crayer's lab has demonstrated that these spontaneous waves moving from temporal to nasal retina are present in the ganglion cell axons within the superior colliculus, and you can see that there's a wave of activity from rostral to caudal superior colliculus, both in the axons and in their postsynaptic cells. So I think that this is basically a conserved mechanism that organizes these topographic maps. So, to summarize this part of the story, what we've shown is that the temporal order of convergent input activity is a source of information which organizes topographic maps, and the spatial information which is embedded in the natural visual scene in the form of optic flow is translated into a temporal code in the sequence of retinal ganglion cell firing, and that this temporal activity is then transformed into the spatial map of within the topographic map. The negative consequences that spike-time-dependent plasticity has on topography. So that story was all about axons and topography and completely ignored the other part of the story, which is basically that they're textile neurons and that they're the ones who are processing this information. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit about experience-dependent properties of inhibitory neurons, and this was a project done by Hai-Han He in my lab. So the postsynaptic cells, the textile neurons, can be imaged beautifully in these neurons by using methods of single-cell or sparse electroporation. And what you see here in this, on the right are a series of two-photon images through the depth of the optic septum. what you see here now is the reconstruction of that same cell, and we can look closely at the dendritic arbor structure and how that changes over time during development and in response to visual input. When we collect time-lapse images in the intact animal, here at every 2 hours over a period of about 8 hours, it's interesting that the dendritic arbor doesn't really change a lot at this time scale, but over a time course of days, you see that the arbor elaborates. And we spent a lot of time investigating why there's so much dynamic in a short time frame without any net growth. Another way of looking at that is shown here, where in these optic-textual neurons, images collected every 10 minutes over a period of hours show that basically every process is dynamic. But remember, these animals are forming connections, they're processing visual information. So we wanted to